One American Story. James Otis Jr., a young Massachusetts lawyer, stormed through the streets of Boston one day in 1760. He was furious. His father had just been denied the post of Chief Justice of the Massachusetts colony by the royal governor. To Otis, this was one more example of Britain's lack of respect for colonial rights. Another example was its use of search warrants that allowed customs officers to enter any home or business to look for smuggled goods. Otis believed these searches were illegal. Otis took up a case against the government that involved these search warrants. In court in February of 1761, Otis spoke with great emotion for 5 hours about the search warrant and its use. Spectators listened in amazement. One of them, a young lawyer named John Adams, wrote of Otis's performance. Then and there, in the old council chamber, the child independence was born. In making the first public speech demanding English liberties for the colonists, James Otis planted a seed of freedom. In this section, you will read more about the early protests against Britain's policies in America. The colonies and Britain grow apart. During the French and Indian War, Britain and the colonies fought side by side. Americans took great pride in being partners in the victory over the French. However, when the war ended, problems arose. Britain wanted to govern its 13 original colonies and the territories gained in the war in a uniform way. So the British Parliament in London imposed new laws and restrictions. Previously, the colonies had been allowed to develop largely on their own. Now they felt that their freedom was being limited. The first of Parliament's laws was the Proclamation of 1763. It said that colonists could not settle west of the Appalachian Mountains. Britain wanted this land to remain in the hands of the Native Americans to prevent another revolt like Pontiac's Rebellion. The proclamation angered colonists who had hoped to move to the fertile Ohio Valley. Many of these colonists had no land of their own. It also upset colonists who had bought land as an investment. As a result, many ignored the law. British troops and taxes. King George III, the British monarch, wanted to enforce the proclamation and also keep peace with Britain's Native American allies. To do this, he decided to keep 10,000 soldiers in the colonies. In 1765, Parliament passed the Quartering Act. This was a cost-saving measure that required the colonies to quarter or house British soldiers and provide them with supplies. General Thomas Gage, commander of these forces, put most of the troops in New York. Britain owed a large debt from the French and Indian War. Keeping troops in the colonies would raise that debt even higher. Britain needed more revenue or income to meet its expenses, so it attempted to have the colonies pay part of the war debt. It also wanted them to contribute toward the costs of frontier defense and colonial government. In the past, the king had asked the colonial assemblies to pass taxes to support military actions that took place in the colonies. This time, however, Parliament voted to tax the Americans directly. In 1764, Parliament passed the Sugar Act. This law placed a tax on sugar, molasses, and other products shipped to the colonies. It also called for strict enforcement of the act and harsh punishment of smugglers. Colonial merchants, who often traded in smuggled goods, reacted with anger. Colonial leaders such as James Otis claimed that Parliament had no right to tax the colonies since the colonists were not represented in Parliament. As Otis explained, taxation without representation is tyranny. British Finance Minister George Grenville disagreed. The colonists were subjects of Britain, he said, and enjoyed the protection of its laws. For that reason, they were subject to taxation. Britain passes the Stamp Act. The Sugar Act was just the first in a series of acts that increased tension between the mother country and the colonies. In 1765, Parliament passed the Stamp Act. This law required all legal and commercial documents to carry an official stamp showing that a tax had been paid. All diplomas, contracts, and wills had to carry a stamp. Even published materials such as newspapers had to be written on special stamped paper. The Stamp Act was a new kind of tax for the colonies. The Sugar Act had been a tax on imported goods. It mainly affected merchants. In contrast, the Stamp Act was applied within the colonies. It fell directly on all colonists. Even more, the colonists had to pay for stamps in silver coin, a very scarce item in the colonies. Colonial leaders vigorously protested. For them, the issue was clear. They were being taxed without their consent by a parliament in which they had no voice. If Britain could pass the Stamp Act, what other taxes might it pass in the future? Samuel Adams, a leader in the Massachusetts legislature, said, "Why not our lands? Why not the produce of our lands? And insure everything we possess and make use of it." Patrick Henry, a member of Virginia's House of Burgesses, called for resistance to the tax. When another member shouted that resistance was treason, Henry reportedly replied, "If this be treason, make the most of it." The colonies protest the Stamp Act. Colonial Assembly, as a newspaper, took up the cry, "No taxation without representation." In October 1765, 9 colonies sent delegates to the Stamp Act Congress in New York City. This was the first time the colonies met to consider acting together in protest. Delegates drew up a petition to the king protesting the Stamp Act. The petition declared that the right to tax the colonies belonged to the colonial assemblies, not to Parliament. Later, colonial merchants organized a boycott of British goods. A boycott is a refusal to buy. Meanwhile, some colonists formed secret societies to oppose British policies. The most famous of these groups was the Sons of Liberty. Many Sons of Liberty were lawyers, merchants, and craftspeople, the colonists most affected by the Stamp Act. These groups staged protests against the act. Not all of their protests were peaceful. The Sons of Liberty burned the stamped paper whenever they could find it. They also attacked customs officials, whom they covered with hot tar and feathers and paraded in public. Fearing for their safety, many customs officials quit their jobs. The protests in the colonies had an effect in Britain. Merchants thought that their trade with America would be hurt. Some British political leaders, including the popular parliamentary leader William Pitt, agreed with American thinking about taxing the colonies. Pitt spoke out against the Stamp Act. Parliament finally saw the Stamp Act was a mistake and repealed it in 1766. But at the same time, Parliament passed another law, the Declaratory Act. This law said that Parliament had supreme authority to govern the colonies. The Americans celebrated the repeal of the Stamp Act and tried to ignore the Declaratory Act. A great tug-of-war between Parliament and the colonies had begun. The central issue was control of the colonies, as you will learn in the next section.